Hey friends, asymmetric information is when buyers and sellers do not have equal access to information. So in a free market, consumers will likely be aware of possible dangers or lower quality goods, and therefore they will consume less. Producers will similarly produce less. And this results in an underallocation of resources relative to what is socially optimum in the production of goods and services. So this results in allocative inefficiency. There are two types of asymmetric information, namely adverse selection as well as moral hazard. In this video, I'll be covering more on adverse selection as well as some responses that consumers and producers may have to avoid this. Adverse selection is when one party in a transaction has more information about the quality of a product being sold as compared to another party. And this applies to both sellers and buyers. So for example, in the context of sellers, imagine a used car seller. A used car seller would have more information about the history and the actual condition and background of the car than a potential buyer. In a similar vein, a buyer of health insurance may have a stronger understanding of their health condition and the actual state of their health as compared to a potential insurance seller. There are two types of responses that help to reduce asymmetric information between buyers and sellers. The first type would be government responses, and the second type would be what we call private responses. So for example, using the used car seller scenario as the example, when a used car seller has more information than a buyer, some government responses can include things like regulation, which is the lemon law, provision of information, as well as licensure. So what exactly is the lemon law when we talk about government regulation? The lemon law applies to both the US as well as in Singapore, and I'm pretty sure in some other countries too. And the idea is that if there is a defect in a car within the first 6 months of purchase, the dealer must repair, replace, or refund the car. In terms of provision of information, used car sellers must clearly disclose the car's history, mileage, and condition when listing these cars online. Lastly, in terms of licensure, used car dealers must have an appropriate license from authorities to sell used cars. So if you think of these responses and the effectiveness of these responses, regulations appear to be the most effective. But while this protects consumers, regulations are time-consuming to implement and they incur large opportunity costs. Similarly, providing information sounds fair in theory, but at times the accuracy of the information can be questionable, or information can also be difficult to find. Sometimes for special roles such as doctors or lawyers, not all information can be provided due to clauses or laws like the patient confidentiality clause. Lastly, one critique of licensing is that licenses could limit the supply of people in a particular profession, which in turn raises the prices of their services and make consumers pay higher taxes. So these are some talking points you can raise when evaluating government responses when seller have more information than a buyer. Now let's move on to private responses. Private responses include things like screening as well as signaling. So screening refers to buyers getting more information about what they're buying from sellers, like how if you're buying a used cars, you would search across different websites online to learn as much as you can about used cars before you make the purchase. Signaling refers to sellers convincing buyers that the products are of good quality, like how your used car dealers can provide things like warranties or service records to validate to the buyer that their used cars are great. Now, the earlier discussion about used cars stems from the fact that the used car seller knows more information than the used car buyer. But what if we flip the table and the roles this time around? What if this time, in the context of health insurance, for example, the buyer has more information than the seller? The private response here can include things like pricing. Here, insurers offer a range of health insurance policies whereby the lower the cost of the insurance, the higher the deductible, the out-of-pocket payment. So in theory, this hedges against risk. People with fewer health issues will pay for lower cost insurance, and people with more health issues would pay for higher cost insurance. But the reality is very different, especially when we talk about a person's income. Often low income earners, they will choose low cost policies regardless of their actual health condition because they are more affordable. It is a huge critique that those who most need health insurance will likely get little or no insurance coverage. So one alternative policy would be for the government to step in and respond to this. So the government can offer direct provision of healthcare services at low or no cost, albeit at the expense of a high cost and a burden on the overall government budget. One very famous example of this would be the UK's NHS system, where healthcare is free of charge because it is financed by tax revenues. While this benefits many people who require health care in terms of cost, there are secondary implications, such as long waiting times and, of course, the opportunity costs that result from using the government's budget.